The night of March 15th started off like any other for those aboard the SS T L Linzen. The Pacific Ocean was calm, the weather was clear, with a few scattered clouds high in the sky, and the stars shone bright, making for an easy watch for the men that night. One man looks up and sees a vapor trail from a high-flying aircraft. With little else to do, he watches the airplane fly by, dipping in and out of the scattered clouds, disappearing behind one large cloud when suddenly a flash erupts, enough to light up the entire ship as if it were daytime. A moment later, two distinct red fireballs crash into the ocean. The watchman doesn't need to report what he's just seen. The entire ship is now wide awake, and the Linzen races off towards the fireballs to look for survivors. The year is 1962, and while the United States does not officially have a military presence in Vietnam, they had been sending advisors since 1955. And before that, supporting France's Indochina War since 1950. All of this to say, in 1962, the United States had quite the stake in Vietnam, and any U.S. troops being sent there had to be done as discreetly as possible. This is where the Flying Tiger line came into play. The first cargo airline in the United States, the military contracted the Flying Tigers to fly these advisors and supplies to Vietnam. Using commercial travel like the Flying Tigers gave the U.S. military plausible deniability of any military presence in Vietnam at the time. However, this plausible deniability doesn't really hold up when it was revealed what a Flight 739 was transporting when it took off from California on March 14, 1962. 93 Army Rangers. Not exactly a supporting staff of advisors. Flight 739 was a nearly brand new Lockheed-built Super Constellation, only 5 years old. This constellation, better known as Connie, was chartered by the U.S. military and operated by the Flying Tiger's own crew of 11. It carried 96 military passengers, the 93 Army Rangers, and 3 Vietnamese military personnel, bringing the grand total of people on board to 107. The flight was straightforward, leaving Travis Air Force Base in California and arriving in Saigon, South Vietnam. Along the way, it would make 4 refueling stops, one in Hawaii, Wake Island, Guam, and finally the Philippines. When Flight 739 arrived in Hawaii, it was briefly delayed for maintenance on the number 1 engine and the number 3 engine, this being the outboard left engine and the inboard right engine. It was then further delayed because the flight crew requested another mattress. So I guess even on top secret military missions, comfort is still a priority. Now let's pause here for a second, because delaying a flight for engine issues sounds like a big deal. And if a flight today got delayed for engine maintenance, you'd probably have second thoughts about continuing on that aircraft. But compared to modern jet travel, this was a different era. Without getting too far into the technical weeds, the Connie was running a high-efficiency version of the Wright R3350 engine, the same engine that the B-29 used. But with this higher efficiency comes higher complexity and more maintenance. So on long trans-Pacific flights, using these refueling stops to do some light maintenance and inspection was far from out of the ordinary. The flight carried on, completing the second leg of its journey and arriving in Wake Island, where again there was some light maintenance done on those same number 1 and number 3 engines. From there, the flight continued on to Guam, where there were no delays, and the Connie was quickly back up in its air, headed for the Philippines, a roughly 6-hour and 15-minute flight. 80 minutes into this flight, the Connie radioed the Guam Flight Service Station. They told them their current location, planned to check in for 1 hour later, and where they expected to be when that check-in occurred. But when this check-in time came, the Guam Flight Service Station didn't hear from the Connie. The Flight Service Station waited about 3 minutes and then tried to make contact with the Connie, but all they got was heavy radio static. 6 minutes after this, they tried again to contact the Connie, but they weren't able to establish any communication. At nearly the exact moment that the Guam Flight Service Station was attempting to contact the Connie, 5 crew members aboard the SS T L Linzen were watching a vapor trail of an aircraft flying high above. And as the vapor trails passed behind a cloud, a bright white explosion was seen, surrounded by a reddish-orange glow with 2 distinct pulses, and 2 flaming objects fell into the sea. As these 2 objects fell into the ocean, the Linzen was able to make radar contact with one of the objects, which gave it a heading to go investigate. The coordinates the Linzen was able to get from this radar contact were the exact same ones that the Connie had given the Guam Flight Service Station as their expected location at that time. The U.S. Army was unaware of what the Linzen had witnessed at this time, so while the tanker was conducting its own search operations, it wasn't until the Connie didn't make it to the Philippines that the U.S. military started their own search operations. The next morning, the plane was officially declared missing, and over the course of the search, nearly 200,000 square miles of ocean were covered, one of the largest operations of the time. Only a piece of driftwood and some tubing were found, and neither were able to be linked to the aircraft. Now, obviously, losing an aircraft with 107 people on board is a terrible tragedy. But here's the thing. This wasn't the first Flying Tiger Constellation to crash while conducting military transport. It wasn't even the first one that day. A separate Flying Tiger Connie, Flight 7816, also conducting military transport, which was destined for Japan, had crashed on a refueling stop in Alaska. Flying Tiger officials, who had just lost 2 aircraft on military transport missions within the span of 24 hours, quickly, and for good reason, called into question sabotage. Up until this point, the Flying Tiger line had only had one incident in 1958 when an aircraft had crashed onto approach into Wake Island. This incident was attributed to poor visibility, which led to an approach that was too low. So now, losing 2 aircraft within 24 hours, it raised a lot of suspicion. Luckily, if that's even the right word, there was plenty of evidence in the crash of 7816, including airport controllers telling the airplane it was too low and to conduct a go-around. The captain did not, and the aircraft struck the ground short of their runway, so it was attributed to pilot error. For Flight 739, on the other hand, there just was no evidence. All there was a missing aircraft and a reported explosion from the Linzen. Now, before we get into the theories of what happened to Flight 739, if you're a fan of aircraft, mysteries, or a combination of both, written and presented by a human, consider liking and subscribing. Now let's get into the theories. With only the reported explosion to go on, the Flying Tiger line did not back down from their claim of sabotage. Experts within the company stating that it would have been impossible for an explosion of that magnitude to occur during normal operations, and no cargo on board the aircraft could have produced such a violent explosion. And while the explosion occurred exactly where Flight 739 was supposed to be at that exact time, with no mayday calls and no wreckage, there was no evidence to support any sort of conclusion. And in the end, the Civil Aeronautics Board stated, "The board is unable to determine the probable cause of this accident from the evidence now available." Others point to potential hijacking, but obviously, hijacking a plane full of highly trained Army Rangers has its own issues. Ultimately, all 107 personnel were presumed killed. And worse yet, given their secretive mission and their role as advisors, those killed weren't even acknowledged on the Vietnam Veteran Memorial in Washington, D.C. when it was opened in 1982. According to the Department of Defense, or Department of War now, because the deaths occurred outside the active combat zone, they didn't qualify. And it wasn't until 2022, 60 years after Flight 739 disappeared, that a memorial was unveiled in Maine. In the end, the closest thing we have to an explanation comes from the crew aboard the SS T L Linzen, who, on a calm, clear Pacific night, watched an airplane fly overhead and disappear in a flash of light, exactly where Flight 739 was supposed to be. So, what actually happened to this Connie? Was there a massive explosion that experts claim couldn't and shouldn't happen? Or something far worse to a plane full of Army Rangers? The truth is, we'll probably never know.